Hello, this is Sagar Kamath from Genesis Mentors and welcome to another one of our input sessions. Now today we're going to look at something which from a contemporary global point of view, from an economic point of view, is something that would bother any student of economics. Now especially if you're following international trade and how world economics functions. It's impossible that you haven't noticed or haven't quite wondered about the perpetual economic dominance of the United States. Now, regardless of how the US economy seems to do, regardless of whether they're doing well or they've just come out of a recession, or whether regardless of who's in power and how much debt that they owe to China, one thing which seems to bother any student of economics is how exactly do they retain their perpetual economic dominance. Now, to understand a little bit about why the dollar is arguably the most important currency in the world, one of the most important international currencies in the world, and the only currency that you can actually trade with in the international market. Let's go back to the year 1944 to look at how all of this began. Now, 1944 is the year when the Second World War is drawing to an end, and we're talking about the very last phase of World War II, with the defeat of Nazi Germany all but imminent. And principally the Western allies, the US, the UK, France, and eventually their ally to the east, the Russians, were now talking about how to tackle the Japanese threat. Hitler's defeat was not going to be a question of an if, it was just a question of a when now. So in 1944 though, the fact that the West was actually winning against the forces of Nazi Germany was to a large point courtesy of the United States. The US had come out of the Second World War, or eventually would come out of the Second World War in unbelievably good, robust health. Right? Gone were the days of the 1920s when the US stock markets had crashed and the 30s had seen great recession and hardships. But the 40s had seen economic boom, and except for the one-off attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor, and that was in 1941, the US had largely been untouched by World War II. So they could afford to invest huge amounts of weapons, manpower, resources, food into the Second World War, and that's primarily what gave the fledgling armies of Britain and France, who are by now at the last legs, this is what actually gave them a second wing. So the US support or the US impact in Second World War was undeniable. And as a result, in any kind of negotiations where, let's say, the East met West, or let's say even negotiations between Britain and the US was arguably going to be calling all the shots. So in 1944, the representatives of the United States, Great Britain and France and a few other member countries met at a small village in New Hampshire called as Bretton Woods. Now, this is an important conversation because what emerged from it has come to be called or come to be known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods Accords or the Bretton Woods Conference is primarily to discuss one facet, that with the new world order about to shape itself, the defeat of Nazi Germany, as we discussed, was all but imminent. So once World War II ends, what is the new world order going to look like? Now, the United States strictly opposed Western colonialism, not so much probably on humanitarian grounds, but because Western-backed colonial powers automatically would have an edge. For instance, regardless of how Britain moved out of World War II, regardless of what the fate of Britain would be, the fact that Britain had colonies across Asia and Africa, and so did the French, would mean that even if you reach a state of bankruptcy, recovering on the back of the colonies or through the labor of the colonial was always going to be an option. But the US didn't quite support the system. The United States, keep in mind, doesn't have any colonies back then. So it was never a market, never a system which believed in the idea of colonialism, at least not overtly. So the US was one of the principal opposition to the idea of colonialism and sustained colonialism, which would mean that in the new world order, how do you ensure the US retains its dominance? As soon as World War II is gone, you'll have Britain and France go back to the colonies and try to recover all the war damages through the colonies. The US said, no, that's not how it's going to work. And as a result, they proposed a new system which would not have colonialism, which would simply be marked by the preeminence of the dollar as the international currency, And regardless of what your currency was, or regardless how your markets did, you had to make sure that your currencies and your monetary systems were pegged to the dollar, which would mean there could be times in your country's eventual journey that you might actually do better than the dollar, or in fact your markets might do better than those of the US. But still, your currencies and your monetary values were always going to be pegged against a dollar. This conference, which followed at Bretton Woods, finalized or crystallized that system. Now keep in mind, this is a big deal, because prior to Bretton Woods, each country, whatever currencies that they used, how do you evaluate what currency is worth? For instance, if you're trading between Britain and France, Britain might consider the pound, the currency that they've been using for quite a while now, they might consider that as a preeminent currency, but the French might not want to give them the status, because then any kind of trade with Britain becomes a lose-win scenario. As a result, all currencies across the world prior to Bretton Woods used to borrow their values from gold. So for instance, whatever gold reserves a country had, a country would have to peg its currency to those gold reserves, which means in theory, whatever money, coins, notes, or any other form of financial instrument that you issue as a nation, it would have to be linked to gold. So the gold standard, which a lot of people even confuse that, that's how currency works in today's system. It doesn't, right? And it actually stopped existing or stopped mattering since 1944, since Bretton Woods. But anyway, that's another story. The fact is, currencies used to be linked to gold, and once they are linked to gold, you had to manage your gold reserves. So for instance, if your gold reserves, your country's gold reserves start to diminish, your value starts depreciating, your currency starts to depreciate. Now you could ask, why would your gold reserves depreciate or deplete? Now there are many reasons for that, namely if you're coming out of bankruptcy. Okay, gold being one of your principal assets, you might have to offshed your assets. But nonetheless, it is important for a country prior to Bretton Woods to maintain its gold reserves, because your currency was ultimately pegged to gold. The reason why the US was opposed to the system was, by default, countries like Britain, France, the Netherlands, to a certain extent, Spain and Portugal, countries which had colonies across the world, they were in a position to add the wealth of the colonies, the gold reserves of the colonies, to their own. You might have heard this term, the Commonwealth. It's something that the UK enjoys even today. For instance, countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand are also part of the Commonwealth. Now, what exactly does that mean? That the financial resources, the gold reserves of these countries and the rest of the colonies were inextricably linked to British gold reserves, which would mean that the pound would perpetually be the most dominant currency in the world simply because they had the most gold. The US opposed this, and at Bretton Woods, in fact, they used quite a lot of gunpoint diplomacy, which is to say that it was in a sense implied that if Britain and France would not consent to giving up the old world order, the US would start to withdraw at least their support in the Second World War. Now keep in mind, it's very important to note that except for Japan, the US doesn't really have any enemies in the Second World War. The fact that the US forces are fighting those of Nazi Germany is actually courtesy Winston Churchill's demand or request. So the long-standing friendship between the US and the continent of Europe, or at least Western Europe, was something that the US was using as a bargaining chip at Bretton Woods. That we are only doing you a favor of fighting the forces of Germany, right? We don't really have any other enemies except for Japan. So we're not really a part of World War II. And if you want to keep us a part of World War II, if you want our ongoing support, you will have to concede to the New World Order. Now Britain and France, of course, grudgingly accept, and the Bretton Woods Accords come into existence from 1944. What would these accords say? According to the accords, from 1944 onwards, no international currency would be related to their gold or would be pegged to their own gold. So the gold standard becomes obsolete overnight. All currencies from now on would be pegged to the dollar. So regardless of where you are and who you are, if you want to be part of the free market, you had to peg your currency against a dollar. That's the only way that your currency got any value, if it's pegged against a dollar. So a rupee is not worth anything by itself because it's no longer going to be backed by gold. But a rupee is worth in terms of how many dollars can it purchase, Or how many dollars or how many rupees does it take to purchase $1? That's the value of the rupee. What about the dollar then? What is its value linked to? Well, here's the clincher. The dollar is going to be linked to gold. So according to Bretton Woods, the dollar would continue getting linked to gold. Okay, the US would have to print or mint dollars based on their gold reserves. The other countries couldn't afford to do that though. They would have to, regardless of their gold reserves, whether or not even they exist, their currencies would only have a value because of purchasing capacities that they have vis-a-vis the dollar. Now, how do you enhance your purchasing capacity? So the French wanted to know this, that fair enough, our currencies are going to be linked to the dollar, but what if we want to have a greater standing or a greater capacity to purchase a dollar? How does that happen? The solution is simple. You'll have to give up your gold reserves. So the French gold reserves were actually taken across the Atlantic and moved to Fort Knox in the US. So the Bretton Woods Conference, the Bretton Woods Accord, which comes into existence from 1944, creates the first draft of US preeminence or US dominance in the economic markets, because regardless of what your currency is and how well or badly your markets are doing, your currency will only have a value because it's got a relationship to the dollar, because it's got a purchasing capacity of the dollar. Now, eventually during the Cold War, the Soviet Union would refuse to be part of this experiment. And as a result, they would try to construct their own independent markets, which would be linked to the ruble. So the idea was that since the US and the Soviets would not really trade with each other, at least not formally, then those countries who were essentially Russian client states, places like Egypt, Syria, large parts of Asia, Central Asia, the countries within the USSR, they would actually play a different game, one where the preeminent currency was going to be the ruble. And your currencies were in a sense linked to the ruble. That's where they got their value from. So, post Bretton Woods from 1944, the United States already has a head start. But of course, at the end of the day, there is an upper limit to what the dollar can be valued, because at the end of the day, the dollar is only as valuable as the gold that the US possess. And without being a colonial empire, the gold that they could possess was finite. So the system goes ahead from 1944 all the way to 1971. Now what happens in the 70s is a couple of major economic decisions hit the United States. For starters, the 1970s sees major oil embargoes. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or also called as OPEC, comes into existence in the 60s. And this is primarily an initiative by countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran and Venezuela, major oil exporting countries, wherein they decide that if you keep pumping up oil in increasing amounts in the international market, the value of the oil collapses. And as a result, it's not a smart thing to do. So what is the solution? OPEC comes into existence as a self-regulating body to ensure that at any stage, the demand for oil in the international markets always outweighs supply, and as a result, keeping up the oil prices at a premium. So the OPEC decisions start to take effect in 1971, where you have major oil cuts which are experienced across the world, including the US. Now what affects the US most of all is the fact that in the 70s, or at least in the early 70s, the United States is fighting an extremely brutal and costly war in the jungles of Vietnam. So the futility of the Vietnam War, even though it was costing tens of thousands of American soldiers, hadn't quite sunk into the US. And as a result, the United States President Richard Nixon was extremely pro-Vietnam, in the sense that he was extremely pro the war. So in an effort to redouble the war efforts, Nixon of course needed more oil buying capacity. Now, the budgets that the US were putting up, the government was putting up, and the Federal Reserves, the currency that they had in dollars, simply wasn't enough to purchase extra oil that you would need to have wars in Vietnam. The Federal Reserve in the US had a limitation. They could not just go into overdrive, minting and printing currency, because that would mean depreciation of the dollar. Now you might ask why. The answer is simple, because until 1971, dollar was still pegged to gold, which would mean if you're not dramatically increasing your gold reserves, and if you're simply putting out more currency, your currency depreciates. Nixon comes up with a solution wherein in 1971 he makes a shock announcement to the world, wherein he said that we're going to abolish or we're going to go past Bretton Woods. Now what does that mean? It would mean that the rest of the world, at least the free market, would continue to be linked to the dollar. That's not going to change. But the dollar is not going to be linked to gold anymore. Okay, so what is it linked to? Answer is nothing. This is what Nixon proposed as fiat currency, which would mean the dollar would have to be considered from here on as having intrinsic value. So you're supposed to look at the dollar bill and assume it has a value for itself. So it's no longer acting like a promissory note. You're not promised that you're going to be paying gold against it, or you're going to be given eventually gold against it, or there is some gold backing the dollar. The dollar is valuable because the dollar is valuable. Okay, that's the argument. So as bizarre as this argument might seem, the rest of the world had no options but to accept this, considering it was proposed by the world's foremost nuclear power. So post 1971, the even newer world order comes into existence, the ones that we have inherited, a world order where all currencies are linked to the dollar, and the dollar is a fiat currency, which would mean it's not linked to anything at all. Now, of course, what this means is that the United States theoretically could put out as much money as it wants and still retain the dollar's preeminence. So if there's a war which is happening, you can simply go into overdrive and put out a little more currency. Now, of course, you can't do it to any levels, because that would, of course, inflate your economies. And unbelievable inflation can lead to a major economic crash. So the Federal Reserve still have to be careful, but they're no longer bound by the gold standard. The idea would be that the US Federal Reserves would know how much money to bring into the circulation. That's the money that the rest of the world can buy from the US. Why would you want to buy the dollar? Because the dollar is the only international currency. It's the only currency against which there is valuation. So gold doesn't matter at all anymore, not even to the US. And that's been the status ever since 1971. Now, it's important to understand the implications of this. It would mean that the rest of the world, aware of the system, aware of the flaws in the system, have been unwilling partners in this adventure ever since 1971. No country or no governance in its right mind would want to play a game where there is one currency which is supposed to have intrinsic value, even though we are not quite told why. The rest of the currencies by default have to be pegged to it. So you have economies in today's world which actually are doing better than the US. For instance, if you look at China. Now, over the last 20 years, the US debt to China has exceeded 3 trillion. Okay? Now, $3 trillion worth of debt is something that the Chinese can demand from the US at any stage. So they have a dollar surplus of 3 trillion that the US owes them. Even then, no matter how much deficit the US has with China, the fact remains that the system simply cannot be overturned. The Chinese currency, the yuan, only has value because it has dollar buying capacity. As soon as you relinquish your dollar buying capacity, so if you say that I no longer want to play this game, right, I'm not going to connect my currencies to the dollar. The fact is, 99% of the rest of the world also closes its markets because your currency by itself is not worth anything. You were only able to trade with those markets because you actually exchange your currency with dollars. And if you turn your back on the dollar, well, that's it then. So this also brings to the light another very important aspect of international diplomacy. Why is the US able to offer so many of what are called as sanctions? And why does the rest of the world fear US sanctions? Or more importantly, how do sanctions actually work? So the answer is simple. Let's look at it on a very simplified scale. For instance, if India were, let's say, trading in onions, okay? Now that's a commodity which actually prices shot up in recent times. So let's say we had to import onions to actually meet demand. Now, this is just an example, keep in mind, okay? This is not a historical event, this is just an example. So if India wants to import onions, now of course it can go into the international market with the rupees that it holds, but the rupees are only worth anything at all because they can be exchanged against a dollar. So even if you're importing onions from Nepal, let's say, the Nepalese or people in Bhutan or the Myanmar government or Pakistan's government doesn't actually care for Indian rupees. The only reason why the Indian rupees would be taken up is because the Indian rupees in turn have a dollar buying capacity. Now we understand against a dollar, the Indian rupee is a weak currency. Roughly we have a range of between 67 to 70, which is the dollar buying capacity. So we would need 67 or 70 rupees to buy $1. But be that as it may, any amount of rupees that are sent into Pakistan or Afghanistan or Nepal or any other country we are trading with can be exchanged for some amount of dollars, and as a result the country would be okay with your currency. So if let's say the US decides to impose sanctions on India for a particular commodity, and let's say it's onions. Now what does that mean? People have a wrong idea about this. A lot of people assume that the US doesn't allow your country to trade in onions. No, but that's incredibly ridiculous. It's not like the US is manually supervising the experiment. It's not like going to come with a whip and say, okay, you're not going to trade with onions. The only thing that changes is that the US would declare in the international markets that as far as onions are concerned, the Indian rupee cannot be exchanged against the US dollar. Now what that would mean is that would immediately send shockwaves across the international markets, because that would mean if you take in Indian rupees for the purpose of, let's say, giving them onions, then that rupee or the amount that you have taken in suddenly has no value, because you cannot exchange it against the dollar. So which is the reason why sanctions or limited sanctions against specific commodities are something that countries dread. Now if let's say, which would mean that if you actually antagonize the US or if you actually offend them in any capacity, go up against any of their trade regulations, there is always an imminent threat that the US would implant sanctions on your countries, but they might not be complete. They might not be like an embargo. Limited sanctions also have the effect because a country often depends on 2 or 3 major imports and 2 or 3 major exports. If sanctions fall on those, then your currency suddenly loses value for those commodities, and as a result no dollars can be purchased. So then a country has to engage in what is called indirect trade, wherein since you can't exchange your rupees directly for onions, you'll have to purchase something else or you'll have to sell something else. Find out what international currency you are able to get in exchange for your sale, in the sense, let's say, promote exports, and use that foreign currency to buy onions, because you can't quite use your domestic currency. There are sanctions in that. So which is the reason why US imposed sanctions are so threatening for a country. Now of course, if sanctions are complete or holistic, as in the complete sweep of the world, let's say all encompassing, the US imposed sanctions on all your exports and all your imports, then again you're allowed to trade. Nobody is physically coming and blocking you. But it's just that nobody would want to trade with you, since your money now suddenly loses all value. Why does it lose value? Because the US says it can't purchase dollars anymore. And this has been the preeminence, so this has been the reason for the preeminence or the economic dominance of the United States, starting off of course from Bretton Woods in 1944, and then of course with Nixon's introduction of fiat currency, we have taken it another level. So what have been the attempts to challenge this system, and what are the impacts of sanctions? Now the fact is, if you look at a large part of the Middle East, especially in the aftermath of ISIS, so if you look at the 2 countries which ISIS primarily targeted, that is Iraq and Syria, they also had, let's say, outreaches in large parts of Libya. They held huge swathes of land. So Libya, Iraq and Syria, if you just look at these 3 countries, one in North Africa and the other 2 in the Middle East. Now, one thing which came to the light was that a lot of people began to allege, after ISIS had established its so-called caliphate, that they were continuing to sell oil on the black market, and important member countries such as Turkey were continuing to buy oil which was produced by ISIS. Now, regardless of the veracity of these arguments, another question emerged, that why have the governments of those countries, and for that matter the US, which has been intervening in this part of the world for some time now, why have they allowed these black markets to continue? Okay, why can't we just take them out? Now what is interesting is, if you look at, in the light of the sanctions and the idea of the sanctions that we discussed, if you look at the dynamics of the Middle East, we realize there is something which is called as embedded violence or embedded conflict or entrenched conflict which exists in these economies. a lot of people would have an idea that the Middle East is in shambles today because the US overthrew dictators like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and they came very, very close to overthrowing supporting the rebellion that was about to overthrow the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Now, and people would have a peripheral view that, that the dictators, at least as brutal as they were, they didn't allow Al-Qaeda or extremism, and they certainly would have clamped down on the black market. So now, because dictators are out of the way, you have the black market and you have radical Islamic groups such as ISIS, which are running riot. Now, an interesting facet which one must understand over here is that research studies of economies in the Middle East, even during or under the dictators, have actually revealed something interesting. That the black market phenomena is not something which ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any other jihadist organizations came up with. This is a phenomena which actually was perpetrated by the dictators, by people like Saddam Hussein, by Muammar Gaddafi, or for that matter Bashar al-Assad. Now, what is the purpose of having a black market? A lot of these dictators at numerous times have received Western support. Assad, for instance, along with his father, has not received support from the West, but has certainly received support from Russia. The US supported Saddam Hussein throughout the 80s when he was warring against Iran. And Gaddafi used to receive intermittent support from both France and Britain. Now, as a result, the dictators knew that there were times that they were in the good books of the West. But the fact is that a dictator is bound to be brutal. There is no such thing as a benevolent dictator. So you had massive purges which were launched against opponents. Any kind of resistance to the regime was quickly and brutally suppressed. And these guys did not have the best records as far as human rights are concerned. Now, as technology keeps progressing and we moved from the 20th to the 21st century, a lot of this actually starts to trickle out, wherein people begin to talk about what's happening. The mass suppression of Kurdish population in Iraq, the suppression of the Sunni in Syria, and the mass killings of groups opposed to Gaddafi in Libya. Now, once you have evidence of this coming out, it becomes embarrassing for Western economies, the so-called free countries, to say that, okay, we are actually in partnership with the dictator, or we are actually supportive of this fellow. Now, internationally, there has to be a call to arms, because the international community would say you can't just stand by and look at what Saddam Hussein slaughter his own people. So what is the solution? The solution has been something which so far has helped kind of distill or give the human rights groups what they want. The solution is impose sanctions. So officially the US would then impose sanctions on Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, or let's say in Russia's case Assad. Now, what do the sanctions mean? Officially it would mean that Saddam Hussein can no longer trade with the international world, and as a result his economy starts to suffer. He gets his act back together and apologizes or stands trial. That never happened though. So the sanctions seem to have fallen on deaf ears. And that's because if you are, as the United States, a major trading partner with, let's say, Iraq, and Iraq had oil exports to the US, so did Libya. If you're a trading partner with one of these countries, the idea of imposing sanctions on them also hurt you as the US, because suddenly your own oil imports start to diminish. Oil, be it oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, whatever. So sanctions also affect the US, because the US cannot stay absolutely independent of this. There are very few countries in the world that the US would have no trading interests with. And for them, of course, you can impose sanctions. But countries in the Gulf, most of them have significant oil reserves. The United States also will have its own industry in places such as Idlib in Iraq, wherein you have Enron with close to $1 trillion worth of energy reserves. Now, if that's the case, sanctions on these countries, or a sanction imposed on Damascus in Syria, the capital, or Baghdad in Iraq, or Tripoli, the Libyan capital, and the government as such, also affects US markets. So what is the solution? The solution is that covertly, the dictators, in a sense supported by the West, were allowed to create an alternate market, quote unquote a black market, over which you could continue to trade in the event that the nation's capital, and in a sense the formal government, undergoes sanctions. So which would mean that even if Saddam Hussein had sanctions imposed on him in Baghdad, the production of resources and the export of resources from Iraq could continue, through maybe second and third tier cities, places like Mosul, Iraq's second biggest city, or places such as, let's say, Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown, or Fallujah or Ramadi. Now, the same can also be seen in Syria, where Damascus might have sanctions because of Assad's crimes against humanity, but a city like Aleppo or Al-Raqqa in Syria, now these cities might actually have alternative markets, quote-unquote black markets, through which the trade can continue. Libyan capital Tripoli might have sanctions, but Sirte, which is an important port town, can continue to actually have trade. And what is interesting is that even when ISIS was at its absolute peak, when they were running riot across these three countries, almost bizarrely, the ISIS groups in Iraq never actually went after the capital of Baghdad. Now you can have an occasional suicide bomber, and that's primarily an opposition to the regime. But the cities that ISIS captured in Iraq were actually Ramadi, Fallujah and Mosul. They never quite went after Baghdad. Now, initially you might wonder, is that because the capital is heavily protected? Well, it turns out capitals aren't very heavily protected. You look at any major capital of the world, yes, there are major monuments like the Parliament or let's say the National Assembly, which might have absolute cutting-edge security. But as a city, you'll have border towns and villages where the bulk of the armed forces is positioned, which are better protected, especially under an all-out assault. So it's surprising that when ISIS was able to launch all-out assaults on places like Mosul and Tikrit and capture them within days, they never tried to experiment that with Baghdad, the capital. Nor did they go after the Syrian capital Damascus. They went after cities like Raqqa, which becomes their de facto capital. They capture the Idlib region, and they also go after places like Aleppo. In Libya, the ISIS stronghold was the port city of Sirte, whereas the capital of Libya is Tripoli. Again, a city that ISIS did not go after. So what does this tell us? That these guys actually played it smart, or they were actually having a clear vision about what they were trying to accomplish. Because if you go after the capital and if you declare a de facto government, a formal government, internationally you would immediately be hit by sanctions. So why bother going after the capital when the rest of the world doesn't quite recognize you? Go after tier 2 and tier 3 cities, because those cannot separately be sanctioned, and that's where the black market happens. So let someone who's, let's say, in favor of the US handle, let's say, Baghdad, or let Assad keep Damascus because the Russians support him, or in the aftermath of Gaddafi's killing, let the rebels who are controlling Tripoli, let them control it. They're largely backed by the West. But go after tier 2, tier 3 cities where the bulk of the black market functions, so that your own economies aren't hampered. So this is an ugly side of sanctions, and also gives rise to what is called as embedded violence, because that would mean even under dictatorships or in the absence of them, violence in large parts of the world as a result of sanctions can actually continue to persist. We talked about Gaddafi and the fact that he was killed in 2011 at the start of what is called as the North African Spring, eventually to be named the Arab Spring. Now, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya was killed in 2011, and he was killed by US-backed rebel forces. Now, what is interesting to note is that Gaddafi had proposed, leading up to 2011, a policy which almost certainly got him killed and certainly got him in the radar of the West. We talked about the dominance or the predominance of the US in terms of the financial or the economic systems of the world, and it's a dominance which Europe, especially Western Europe, countries like France and Britain, have actually enjoyed. And this is mainly because, like alongside their close ties with the US, they've also given themselves the most capacity for purchasing dollar. France has got a lot of North Africa, and especially Sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Niger, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, Liberia. A lot of these countries are hooked on to French money because France has got them into a debt trap. You take loans which you can't repay, and for that you take more loans, and the lendee in each case is France. So most of North Africa finds itself in a debt trap with the French. There is militancy, piracy, extreme starvation and hunger, resource crunch, while at the same time these countries are not very resource poor, which makes the irony even more palpable. Now, as a result, Muammar Gaddafi, who fancied himself as a Pan-African leader, had proposed an audacious plan leading up to 2011, where he proposed something called as the African Union. Now, the idea of the African Union, or the AU, was going to be a mirror image of what we call the European Union, or what Europe has managed to put together since the 2000s. So the idea of the African Union was that there will be one pan-African currency called as the African dinar, which all member countries of the African Union would from now on continue to abide by. Now keep in mind, the African dinar never actually came into existence. But what made Gaddafi's plan economically so genius is that the African dinar was going to be in gold. So it was not going to be printed, it was only going to be minted. Now, why this is so significant is Libya had enormous gold reserves, and so too Ghana. So these two countries were going to be the primary participants in actually helping mint the African dinar. This will of course be distributed across the continent, as in each country would have to buy the African dinar. If you wanted to be part of the AU, that is going to be the currency of choice. But if your currency has gold in it, and any other country outside the continent, let's say Europe or Asia or the Americas, any one of them trades with you or even expects a repayment of the debt that you owe to them, they will have to accept the gold currency. Now, once they accept the gold currency and they're accepting it in exchange of the money that they lent it to you, they of course lent out paper currency. In exchange for that money, they're accepting gold currency. Now, one has to understand, unlike any other example of currency, including the dollar, gold has an intrinsic value. And if it is an intrinsic value, it would mean that you might not really consider the African dinar to be worth much. But the fact that it's minted with at least half an ounce or 2 ounces of gold has an intrinsic value. Gold can purchase the dollar, which would automatically mean that if in a single transaction which Europe were to accept as repayment of the debt, if they accept any of the African Union's new currency, the gold currency, automatically Europe ends up linking its own currency with the gold standard. And of course, countries have moved past the gold standard since 1944 to the point where most of the world economy today functions as if there is an arbitrary value that the dollar would subscribe to. So the linking of gold once again to economics had the potential of overturning the fortunes of Africa within a decade. We could have in fact had a scenario where Africa would probably end up as being one of the wealthiest continents, as being against the poorest. So Gaddafi's plan, genius as it was backed by an extremely flawed man who had huge debt of human rights violations against him. And in the heat of the North African Arab Spring, Gaddafi was one of the first dictators to be taken out. In fact, what we call as the Arab Spring, in fact, is the North African Spring, because three major North African economies, including Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia, were swept in the wake of revolution, and it only then begins to trickle out into the Middle East, with Syria being the most badly hit. So this in a nutshell gives us a picture about why the United States has retained its predominance and has thwarted any attempts to overturn this new world order. So any discussions from now on which you might want to have, whether it's in a GD or a PI, and let's say talking about things like the US-China trade war, so you're talking about why the US continues to remain the power that it does, needs to have this particular backdrop. So I hope it was an informative session, and I hope you can take something away from this. Stay tuned in to watch more such updates and more such input sessions, and make sure to subscribe to our channel, like our videos. Thank you so much.